Hi, my name is Adrian Peck. I'm a lecturer here at Newbold College in Pastoral Theology, and today I'm going to be discussing pastoral perspectives and the pastoral imagination. In February 2024, Drew Ferrazzi published an article in Relevant magazine online entitled "Why I Can't Stand the Church and I'm the Pastor." And he goes on to explain why he can't stand his church. He says, "Sometimes I just don't like the songs we sing. I want a worship experience that draws me into realizing God's presence in amazing ways. And I want that every week. And some weeks it just doesn't happen. I can't stand my church because sometimes what is offered isn't as great as the announcements promise them to be. Often, the timing of events are super inconvenient for me and my family. I can't stand my church," he goes on, "because they talk about money and serving way too often, always asking me to be more involved. I can't stand my church because it has a lot of hypocrites and people deeply hurt me. I can't stand my church because as nice as people are, it's still hard to deeply connect with them. I try to greet everyone every week," he writes, "but building strong, intentional relationships and friendships is hard. I can't stand my church because, frankly, there's a lot that can get better, and I know other churches in the area that do this or that a lot better." He's being purposefully provocative here, of course, but his point resonates, I think, because I have had many a conversation with pastoral colleagues where they frankly admit they would not attend the church or churches to which they have been assigned out of choice. And it might be axiomatic to suggest that fortunate is the pastor who is assigned to a church whose worship style and format and ethos suits them personally. Now this highlights at least one or two issues. First of all, where and how does the pastor get fed and nourished? Now that's something I do not intend to directly cover, at least in this session. The second thing is, and especially in the quote that I read out to you, is that it reveals somewhat of a consumerist perspective. And that cannot be a perspective that a pastor has. It cannot be about a pastor approaching the congregation from the perspective of what can I get out of this arrangement. Rather, it is the perspective, of course, it is the perspective of how can I serve. And in order to serve, the pastor needs to take on board various perspectives, some of which I intend to unpack as we go through. The first one is that I want to look at is the pastor as a hermeneutician. Now, as we all know, one of the challenges that faces us as we seek to read and interpret the Bible is to develop our hermeneutical skills, surface our presuppositions, learn something of the original languages, Greek, Hebrew, Aramaic, etc., learn to understand the historical and geographical and linguistic backgrounds of the people for whom the Bible was originally written. But I suggest that there is a need to broaden the principles that underlie these processes by applying them to the way that the pastor functions more generally. That to step into the lives of members and the congregation of which they are a part is to be given the responsibility to understand their history, their location. And of course, location is multifaceted. It could be their social location, geographical location. There are spatial elements to it. It is to be given the responsibility to understand their language, their vocabulary, traditions, rituals, and so on. In other words, the pastor does not just need to be able to interpret Scripture, but also to interpret what has been termed living human documents. Living human documents. At its root, this starts with seeing things for the way they are. And to be able to do that, we need to be able to engage all five senses as facts are gathered. as information is accumulated. And so what is arrived at potentially is what anthropologist Clifford Geertz famously coined as being a thick description, Thick descriptions, and here I'm leaning on Imi Holloway here to expound upon that concept. Thick descriptions are detailed accounts that make explicit the patterns of cultural and social relationships and puts them into context. Pastors, therefore, should avoid, abhor even, surface-level readings, not only of texts, but of those living human documents that are placed in their care. And because a pastor has to deal with and understand people, there is a sense in which pastors have to follow in Geertz's footsteps and also be anthropologists. Studiers of anthropoi, studiers of humankind. In anthropological terms, this opens the door for pastors to more intentionally adopt two particular perspectives, the emic and the etic. The emic perspective is the insider perspective. The etic perspective is the opposite of that, or the converse of that. It is the outsider's perspective. And so pastors, I suggest, occupy the liminal space between those two perspectives. They have both of those perspectives to a degree. They have an emic perspective because pastors are part of the congregation. And therefore they are part of the group that can describe the congregation in their own terms and are part of the group that can understand the framework of meaning from which that is derived. But pastors are also able to take an etic perspective, in that pastors are able to take a step back, as it were, and observe the congregation. Now, one might question whether to have both an insider and outsider perspective, both an emic and an etic perspective, question whether that's even possible. And I suggest it's more than just a delicate balance to be had. More explicitly, it is the ability to flip between the two perspectives and bring the strengths of each into play whilst recognizing their weaknesses. And there is a few places in the literature now, as scholars suggest, that this ability to flip between the emic and etic and back to the emic perspective again is a valid way of proceeding and processing information. And so if one was to emphasize the emic perspective, this means the voice of the congregation will be heard. Their viewpoint on church and worship and God will start to emerge. As the pastor embeds themselves more and more into the congregation, they will in turn more and more be able to help articulate that perspective. But rely on the emic perspective only, however, and things can get assumed, things can be missed. An example of where this might show itself, consider when you are having some very special visitors at home. You're getting your house ready for those visitors. And suddenly you are forced, in a sense, to have an etic perspective. You are seeing your home, your house, your living conditions through the eyes of the visitor. And so if I was doing that, if I was running around cleaning and tidying up, I could start to see my living conditions from their perspective, which means that previously unnoticed piles of dust accumulating in the corners, well, they each now represent an opportunity for me to be embarrassed. My decision to delay decorating duties can come back to haunt me in the form of chipped and tired paintwork, flaws that I have simply been able to phase out as I go about my living day to day, but now they suddenly shout out to me. From an emic perspective, such issues could become so absorbed into the background, into the environment, they just become background noise, as it were. And so they can lose their significance, they lose their visibility. Another example might be, if we bring it to the congregation, is that I don't think I've ever heard a congregation say that they are not welcoming and friendly. But the reason that we are always able to say in general that the congregation is welcoming and friendly is because we are taking an emic perspective. We are experiencing the church and the church welcome and in its degree of friendliness as an insider. Whilst visitors, it's visitors that have that etic perspective. And so you often come across those who have visited a particular church and then they say, "Can you believe it? No one spoke to me. I walked in and out of the church building and no one even shook my hand." Or others might say, "I can't understand why they embarrassed me by making me stand up in front of everyone." You see, from an emic perspective, from an insider's perspective, to make people stand up might seem like the epitome of how to be friendly and welcoming. But from an etic perspective, it can be rather disturbing, shall we say. So an etic perspective allows the pastor to avoid such over-familiarity. It allows the pastor to, in a sense, benchmark the congregation against others, against other expressions of church, other forms of worship, for example. And this then, in turn, allows the pastor to have an informed critique. Now, if we overemphasize the etic perspective, the pastor will start to distance themselves too much from the congregation. That's the downside of the etic perspective. The people who they pastor will only ever be, in a sense, research subjects rather than people to whom to relate. Now, it's this ability to have this insider and outsider perspective that is one of the pastor's gifts to the congregation in their care, I believe. A pastor then does not just enter into the life of the church and simply takes what's on the surface, and simply sees what's on the surface, but they interrogate, they examine, they observe, they use their good people-watching skills. And so they look at people's demeanour, they look at their body language, their posture, they observe as people interact, but they stay with those interactions to see what the outcomes are. Now this, of course, this should be a multi-sensory experience. And you can see that, or you can understand that observation, sight and hearing, sound are the key ones. And I just want to emphasize the latter because as pastors we get so used to doing public speaking and having people listen to us that I think we need to intentionally prioritize that listening element. That we need to actively listen, of course, that we need to intentionally listen, that we need to create opportunities to listen. Now, having done all that good work, something needs to be done with the information arising out of those observations, that listening. The pastor then asks the question, well, what does this all mean? And so it's not just about making observations, it's not just about collecting data. It then follows that we need to interpret things. We need to interpret things in order to move from knowledge to understanding. And so the pastor, being a hermeneutician and an anthropologist, is able to undertake what is known as cultural interpretation. Cultural interpretation. And here, leaning on Helen Cameron and Catherine Deuce, cultural interpretation is that which arises out of an extended period of observation and participation in a community of practice. Now here you can see the interplay between an emic and an etic perspective coming out. There is the etic perspective, the outsider's perspective, that is seen in that extended period of observation that goes on. But then we get the emic coming through, the insider perspective, through participation in the community. The pastor isn't just a detached observer. Now, we need to be aware, we need to be conscious, careful, of course, to remember that this is a spiritual enterprise. And we know from Ephesians chapter 4 that the pastor is a leader who has the spiritual gift of pastoring. And I suggest it is as that gift is put into practice that it becomes a spiritual discipline, or as some put it, a spiritual habit. There is a growing recognition in the wider field of practical theology, and pastoral theology is obviously a part of that, whereby the enterprise, undertaking practical theology, is seen as a spiritual discipline. And I think this is an important perspective to have. Because there is a temptation to see practical or pastoral theology as being about applying the latest tricks or tips or techniques. However, we can move away from trivializing the task in this way by embracing the spiritual perspective and being theologically informed. And this is how habit, I said you could have it as a spiritual discipline or a spiritual habit. This is how the idea of it being a spiritual habit, I think, works well. It might be the better word, for it implies that this is a way of life, a way of being for the pastor. Pastoring is therefore something that relies on the presence, the resourcing, the empowerment that comes through the Spirit. Therefore, that insider-outsider view I discussed is informed by a third dimension, if that's the right phrase, and it is the most important one, and that is God's perspective. And so we have another question that pastors should ask. How can my perspective as a pastor be transformed and informed by the Spirit? One of the ways to look at this is to build on the strengths of the missional church movement. The missional church movement that stems from the work of Gouda and Goheen and New Begin, etc. And they have a concept of partnering with God on his mission. Now, there is a phrase out there, sometimes attributed to Rowan Williams, associated with Fresh Expressions, mostly associated with Henry Blackaby, that goes something like this. It's about seeing what God is doing and joining in. So the idea is that God is already out there working. God is not waiting for us, but God is already, through the Spirit, prompting and persuading and revealing. The idea then is that when we're thinking about mission or evangelism or any aspect of church and pastoring, I suggest, that what we're seeking to do is to partner with God. That we're seeking to understand God's perspective, what God is doing. In this sense, the pastor is not only a hermeneutician and an anthropologist, but has a prophetic role. As in, someone who places themselves in the middle of the complexities of divine, human and interhuman relationships. Someone who, through intentionally seeking out what God is already doing, relies on spiritual discernment and godly wisdom to inform their understanding. And in so doing, it will enable them to see the possibility, and this is a great word to focus on, to see the possibility of congregational activity cohering with divine activity. A prophetic role also brings with it hope. And this brings us to the outcome of all of this activity. Eugene Peterson, who translated the Message version of the Bible and has written some great books on pastoring, I recommend him, came up with what he defines as the pastor's question. And according to him, the pastor's question is this one: who are these particular people, and how can I be with them in such a way that they can become what God is making them? And we can see many of the elements that I've already been discussing coming out just in this question, this one question. So at the beginning he asks, who are these particular people? So we can see the utility in the anthropological, the ethnographic, the hermeneutical work that I was referring to earlier. We need to dig deep to understand people. And then, and that is, by the way, the etic perspective coming through, the outsider's perspective, if you will. And then he brings the emic into play in the next phrase by asking, how can I be with them? How can I be with them? That's bringing in the emic. And then notice the tense that he's using towards the end of that question, because he says that they can become what God is making them, what God is making them. So we get that sense that God is already working and we are to go and join him. The pastor, therefore, does not just see what is and understands that intimately and reflectively, but through engaging with the divine, they see the possibilities for the congregation and the people in their care. And therein lies hope, I suggest. To develop this further, I'm going to draw on the work of Craig Dykstra, who has developed the concept of the pastoral imagination. The pastoral imagination. And he suggests that by using the pastoral imagination, the pastor doesn't just see what is, but what could be. And he describes that as a process of discernment, similar to the one I referred to earlier. In his words, he calls it seeing through the eyes of faith, seeing through the eyes of faith. And he suggests that this way of seeing through the eyes of faith, interpreting shapes what the pastor thinks and does and how he or she responds to people, gestures, words and actions. It functions as a kind of internal gyroscope, he says, guiding pastors in and through every crevice of pastoral life and work. The pastoral imagination, as Dykstra conceives of it, is multifaceted, and I'm just going to draw on a couple of aspects in this session. And in many ways, you will see that he helpfully resonates with much of what I've been expounding upon so far. First of all, the pastoral imagination requires us actually to have that emic perspective. As pastoral imagination is only received and developed in the midst of life spent in service to God's people. It only emerges as we interact with others and as we seek to bring God to others in their lives and in the lives of the congregation. Another aspect is that the pastoral imagination is about seeing in depth. To perceive, quoting Dykstra here, to perceive more in what is already before us, to see beneath the surface, to get beyond the obvious, the merely conventional, to note the many aspects of a situation, to attend to the deep meaning of things. So you can see all that work that I framed in terms of anthropology and hermeneutics coming through there. He then goes on to suggest that the pastoral imagination uses a certain kind of intelligence. Now there seems to be an ever-expanding different categories of intelligence, IQ and EQ, etc. And one might come up with PQ, the pastoral quotient, the pastoral intelligence. Dykstra suggests that this kind of intelligence is one that enables pastoral work of real creativity and integrity. And so again, it's not just about seeing what is, but about seeing what could be. And then, in order to build on this, he brings in what might be called a prophetic role, prophet with a small p, where he says it's about not just seeing what is not, but about seeing what could be and then bringing it into being. And we need to do that creatively. And we need to do that with integrity. And the way to do that is to continually seek God's perspective in things and to go through that exercise of determining what God is already doing in the environment in which we are operating as a pastor. Finally, just to draw on one more thing from Dykstra, I suggested that to be a pastor and to do our pastoral work is to take a multi-sensory approach. And Dykstra takes that further in advocating for a holistic approach, if you will, because it says it's not just a multi-sensory experience or a vocation in that sense, but it also involves emotions as much as reason, heart as much as head. And I suggest that all these considerations elevate the discussion above and beyond any consumerist concerns that we are all likely to have. It helps insulate us from the worst excesses of that attitude, what can I get out of this, and moves us towards that servant leader approach that many have written about. To move from what may seem to us, well, this is dissatisfying, this is not meeting my needs, to focusing on what could be. What could be as we look at the congregation and the members there. To see and to know that God is already at work, a profound concept, I think, such that pastors can be informed, reflective agents of change. Thank you.